October 1940. Over the English Channel, the Messerschmitt's cannon fire tore through the B-17's starboard wing. 22-year-old Private James Marshall felt the impact before he heard it, a shattering crunch that knocked him sideways against his oxygen mask. Black smoke filled the radio operator's compartment. He couldn't see the pilot, couldn't see anything except the spinning horizon and the red tracer rounds cutting through the clouds. The intercom was dead, just static and the howl of dying engines. He grabbed the emergency hatch release, hands trembling. His crewmates were already bailing out, 7 parachutes blooming white against the gray sky. But Marshall hesitated. The altimeter was dropping fast. Too fast. 2,000 feet. 1,500. The ground was rushing up, a patchwork of German fields. He jumped. The parachute opened with a jerk that nearly broke his neck. For 3 seconds, he floated in blessed silence. Then he heard them, voices shouting in German, the sound of boots running through stubbled wheat. He hit the ground hard, rolled twice, and scrambled to gather his chute. Too late. A German soldier stepped on the silk, pinning it down. Then 3 more came running from the hedgerow, rifles leveled. They were kids, maybe 16 or 17, barely older than Marshall. Their uniforms were too big. Their eyes were hungry and afraid. "Hands!" the first one screamed in accented English. "Hands up now!" Marshall raised his hands. The tallest soldier approached and smashed his rifle butt into Marshall's stomach. The American doubled over, gasping. A second blow cracked across his back. He fell to his knees. "American pig," the young soldier spat. They threw him in a truck. There were 6 other airmen already in the bed, bruised, bleeding, one unconscious. A bombardier from his squadron, Sergeant Cole, was clutching a broken arm. Their eyes met for half a second. Cole shook his head slightly. A warning. Don't resist. Don't run. The truck bounced along dirt roads for hours. By the time it stopped, the sun was setting, and Marshall could taste blood. They were marched into a processing station, a converted schoolhouse with swastika banners and filing cabinets. A German officer in a pressed uniform sat behind a desk, looking thoroughly bored. He asked them their names, ranks, and serial numbers. That was all. The Geneva Convention was written on a poster on the wall, but it felt like a joke. That night, they were locked in the basement. Concrete walls, a single light bulb, no blankets, no food. Midnight came, and someone was crying. Marshall couldn't tell if it was Cole or someone else. The sound echoed off the stone. By morning, there were 12 prisoners in the basement. An older officer came down, maybe 50, with a scarred face and cold blue eyes. He carried a wooden baton and tapped it against his leg as he paced. When he spoke, his voice was almost conversational. "You are prisoners of the Third Reich now. You will comply with all orders. You will not speak unless spoken to. Any attempt to escape." He paused and tapped the baton against his palm. "Any such attempt will be punished with death. Do you understand?" No one answered. He nodded and smiled, like he'd expected that. "You will be transported to a permanent camp within the week. You will remain there until the war ends, perhaps many years, perhaps forever." He turned to leave, then stopped at the door. "The war is already won. Germany is invincible. America is finished. You are the guests of a superior military power. Do not forget that." The door slammed. The light flickered. In the darkness, Marshall understood something concrete for the first time. He wasn't a soldier anymore. He was a prisoner, and the Germans weren't wrong about one thing. The war could last for years. They loaded him into a cattle car 3 days later. The journey to Stalag Luft III would take 18 hours. By the time he arrived, Marshall had already started planning his first escape. Stalag Luft III, January 1941, 18 days. That's how long Marshall had been planning his escape before he even met the man who would change everything, a British pilot named Lieutenant Geoffrey Ward. They'd been digging since the first week they arrived, using mess tins and old cutlery hidden in their clothes. The tunnel started under the floorboards of Barrack 7, behind the stove where the German guards never looked. It was crude, desperate work, suffocating, but it was hope. The camp was worse than the basement at Dulag. Dulag had been chaos and confusion. This place was calculated cruelty. Barbed wire arranged in a geometric pattern that took hours to walk around if you tried to circle it. Guard towers every 100 meters. Searchlights that swept the compound every 20 seconds. The Germans had thought about this. designed it specifically to prevent men like Marshall from trying exactly what he was now doing. Ward was a pilot from RAF Spitfire Squadron 222, shot down over Belgium. He'd spent the previous year in 3 different camps, and in 2 of them, he'd attempted escapes. Both times he'd been caught within kilometers. Both times he'd been beaten. Both times he'd come back, angrier but not beaten. When Marshall found him in the exercise yard on day 18, Ward was sitting quietly on a bench, whittling a piece of wood with a stolen knife. "You're looking for men," Ward said, not looking up. "For the tunnel." Marshall's blood went cold. They'd been careful. So careful. "I've done this before," Ward continued. He held up the wooden knife. "Bad, but it passes inspection from 10 meters away. I know how to survive in the field. I speak French. And I know exactly what the Germans will do when they find out someone's missing." He finally looked at Marshall. His eyes were gray and utterly certain. "When, not if. So we need to move tonight." Marshall didn't know this man, but he knew desperation. He knew the look of someone who'd already accepted death and was now simply deciding which way to meet it. So he nodded. They brought in 2 other Americans, Sergeant Tom Riley, a bombardier who'd been shot down with Marshall, and a corporal named Jack Hendricks from a different squadron. Hendricks was younger, maybe 20. He'd never escaped anything in his life, but he could dig, and he didn't ask questions. The tunnel was finished at 1847 hours. It ran 37 meters from Barrack 7 to a point just beyond the perimeter fence. The exit was carefully masked with brushwood and turf, lifted so cleanly it looked untouched. The Germans had run dogs through the compound that morning, standard routine, but the dogs hadn't stopped. The scent would be strongest at the fence line. The Germans always looked there. The tunnel exit was instead placed 6 meters away from where the fence ended, in a patch of woods the guards rarely entered because they had no reason to. It was brilliant planning. Or it would be, if it didn't require 4 men to squeeze through 37 meters of earth, barely large enough to crawl through. At 2100 hours, when the searchlights made their sweep and briefly looked away from Barrack 7, Marshall went first. The tunnel was narrower than he expected. The earth was colder. His shoulders scraped both sides at once. He could feel the weight of the entire camp pressing down on him from above. Somewhere ahead, he heard Ward scratching at the tunnel wall. They'd deliberately left the last meter unsealed so they could break through from inside. 4 minutes. The 4 men had agreed. 4 minutes for each crawl. If someone took longer, the next person would go anyway. Stagger the exits. Don't create a pattern. Don't all be missing at once. Marshall's 4 minutes felt like 40. His lungs burned. His fingers scraped bloody against the compressed earth. Once his shirt caught on a protruding root, and for a moment he couldn't move forward or backward. He nearly screamed. He didn't. He twisted, tore the shirt, and kept moving. The exit was there. Ward had broken through and was already outside, his silhouette briefly visible against the starlight. Marshall clawed his way out of the hole, rolled into the woods, and lay still for what felt like hours but was probably 30 seconds. Riley was next. Then Hendricks. All 4 men were now in the woods, 60 meters from the fence, breathing the cold night air of the German forest. Ward was already taking bearings from the stars. "We move northeast. Monschau is about 12 kilometers. We rest there. Tomorrow night, we make for the border, another 20 kilometers." He was speaking the way soldiers speak when everything is suddenly real, fast, matter of fact. "Stay together, stay quiet. If we get separated, each man for himself. Don't come back for anyone. Understood?" They understood. They walked through the night, froze in a barn for 6 hours the next day while German soldiers passed on the road outside, ate raw eggs from a farmer's storage, left 4 watches as payment. Watches they'd all saved for months, knowing that someday they might need to trade them. By the second night, they could see the lights of a town. Ward said it was approaching Monschau, nearly free. They were resting in a thicket of pines when the dogs came. There was no warning. The barking came first, then the sound of engines, trucks, at least 2. Flashlights swept through the darkness. The soldiers had been waiting at Monschau, not searching randomly. The German guards at Stalag Luft III had discovered the tunnel during evening count. 2 hours later, they'd notified the Wehrmacht stations along the border. And the Wehrmacht had done exactly what every border guard in history does. They'd waited at the most logical crossing point. "Run!" Ward shouted. Marshall ran. Behind him, flashlight beams slashed through the forest like bayonets. A rifle cracked, then another. Not aimed. Warning shots. The dogs were closer now, their breathing audible through the trees. Riley was directly ahead, running hard. Hendricks bolted left toward the trees. Ward was somewhere behind. Marshall couldn't tell where in the chaos of running and branches tearing at his face. A German soldier emerged from the darkness directly in Marshall's path, rifle raised. There was a moment, just a fraction of a second, where Marshall could have kept running, could have knocked the rifle aside, could have tried for freedom. Instead, he stopped. His legs simply wouldn't carry him forward. The soldier was young, younger even than Hendricks, maybe 18. His rifle was shaking. "Nicht bewegen," the soldier shouted. "Don't move." Marshall didn't move. Riley and Hendricks were caught 5 minutes later. Riley tried to fight, but his arm was already broken from the tunneling. Hendricks just surrendered without resistance, his youth working against him. The soldiers saw a kid and simply tackled him. Ward tried to fight. He actually got past one soldier, almost made it back to the tree line. A rifle butt to the back of his skull changed his plans. The truck ride back to Stalag Luft 3rd took 3 hours. Marshall's hands were bound behind his back. Riley's arm hung useless at his side. Ward was bleeding from his head. The Germans wanted them alive for interrogation. They wanted to know how the tunnel was built. They wanted to know who had helped. They wanted to send a message to the other prisoners. They succeeded on all counts. The punishment was 3 months in the cooler, solitary confinement in a 6x8 concrete cell with a single window too high to reach. 18 hours a day darkness, bread and water, no communication with other prisoners. Marshall counted the days on the wall, scratching marks with a loose concrete chip. 180 marks by the time they let him out. But the German guards didn't know that Marshall was now even more certain of one thing. Escape was possible. The tunnel had almost worked. They'd made it 70 kilometers. Another 12, and they'd have been in Belgium. Another 20, and they'd have crossed into neutral territory. Next time, he wouldn't fail. Next time, he'd reach Colditz. Stalag Luft 3rd, June 1942. The transfer notice came on a Tuesday morning. No explanation, no warning. Just a guard standing in front of Marshall's bunk with a clipboard, reading off names. His name was there. 3 other men were transferred with him. Officers who'd made trouble. Pilots who'd asked too many questions. Men like him who'd proven they couldn't be contained. Marshall had been in Stalag Luft 3rd for 17 months since his first escape attempt. 17 months of interrogations. 17 months of planning second and third attempts. 17 months of being labeled dangerous. The transfer was both punishment and acknowledgement. He'd become too much of a problem for an ordinary camp. The train ride took 16 hours. Marshall watched Germany pass outside the window through a gap in the blacked-out carriage. Cities reduced to rubble, fields full of nothing but burned earth, signs of a war that was slowly consuming everything. At one point, he saw other prisoners in an adjacent car. They looked hollowed out, broken. He wondered if that's what he looked like now. When they arrived, the first thing Marshall noticed was the castle. Colditz wasn't a prison. It was a statement. Medieval fortress perched on a hill above the town of Colditz in Saxon Switzerland. Walls that had survived centuries. Towers that could see in every direction. The Germans hadn't built this place. They'd repurposed it. Turned history into architecture designed specifically for one thing, keeping men like Marshall inside. The commandant was a thin colonel with precise mannerisms and cold eyes. On Marshall's first morning, he stood on the courtyard steps and addressed the assembled prisoners. "You are here because the other camps couldn't hold you," the commandant said, his English clipped and exact. "You are here because you are persistent, imaginative, dangerous." He paused, letting that sink in. Colditz has never had a successful escape. Not one. 32 escape attempts in 6 years. All failed. Do you know why? Because you are not dealing with incompetence here. You are dealing with German engineering, German psychology. We have thought of everything. The escape committee had already existed long before Marshall arrived. Run by a British major named Wally Hammond, it was a sophisticated organization. Tunnels, coded messages, forged documents, everything. They'd trained for this, planned for this. But Colditz was different. The problem wasn't the guards. The problem was the geography. The castle sat on a narrow hill with only one way out, across the valley bridge toward the town. Every step away from the walls was visible from the guard towers. Every shadow was calculated, every angle of escape already accounted for. The Germans had taken the lessons from every failed escape and built them into Colditz. But there was one weakness, One possibility. Marshall discovered it in the third week, during his first assigned work detail. He was cleaning the courtyard, a task given to new prisoners to teach them that Colditz was no different than any other camp. While he worked, he noticed something. The eastern wall above the chapel had a section of stonework from the medieval period, older than the rest, looser. The Germans had renovated most of the fortress, but this corner, overlooked or considered impossible, had been left original. If you could get to that wall, if you could move the stones, if you had time and tools and 10 other men willing to risk execution, if you could move enough stone to create a hole large enough for a man to fit through, then you could drop 15 meters to the roof of the chapel below. From the chapel roof, you could theoretically reach the valley on the other side. The blind spot. The one place the guards didn't watch because no one was supposed to be able to get there. Marshall brought the discovery to Hammond. 15 meters to the chapel roof, Hammond said. They were sitting in the library, surrounded by books. Thousands of books. Colditz had a library because the Germans believed intelligent men could be pacified with information. That's a broken leg in the best case, death in the realistic one. What if we didn't jump? Marshall asked. What if we built something? A rope ladder, weighted. We have cloth from the uniforms. We have wire from the beds. We could... We? Hammond interrupted. You've been here 3 weeks, Marshall. This is a British operation. American escapers work with us, but they don't lead us. Marshall understood. He was new. He was American. He was expendable. But Hammond was listening, which meant the idea had merit. The planning took 3 months. 3 months of meticulous preparation while Marshall and 2 British pilots, a man named Blackwell and another called Thompson, worked the stones loose from the inside of the wall, a millimeter at a time, using pieces of broken mirror and makeshift tools fashioned from bed springs. They worked during the daily exercise period when the guards were watching the courtyard and not the eastern perimeter. They filled the gaps with plaster so the damage wasn't visible from outside. The rope ladder was constructed from bed sheets torn into strips and braided with electrical wire stolen from the chapel wiring. Each segment was hand-stitched by a bombardier who'd been an engineer before the war. The ladder could theoretically support 140 kilograms, the weight of a single man moving quickly. The theory was that each man would descend as rapidly as possible, minimizing the time the rope was under tension. Quick movement, no hesitation, 1 man every 8 seconds. They selected 5 men: Marshall, Blackwell, Thompson, a Norwegian officer named Anderson, and a German-speaking American corporal named Fisher, whose forged papers were so perfectly executed that if they made it to Switzerland, he could walk across the border in a German uniform and potentially avoid immediate capture. The escape date was set for October 15th, a Tuesday. No particular reason for Tuesday except that it was random. The Germans had already searched for planned escape attempts. Killing them on a random day reduced the possibility of a setup. October 15th arrived cloudy and cold, the kind of day where visibility from the guard towers was reduced by mist. Fate, Marshall thought, or just luck. There was very little difference when your life depended on luck. At 14:30 hours during the afternoon exercise period, Marshall excused himself for a bathroom run. Inside, he changed into the uniform Blackwell had stolen piece by piece over months. He joined Thompson in the chapel storage room. Anderson and Fisher were already there. Blackwell was at the wall, having loosened the final stone that morning. "We go in 30 seconds, Thompson whispered, in the order we discussed. "Marshall, you're third. 8 seconds between each man. If the alarm sounds, you scatter. Get to the woods. Individual survival becomes priority. Understood?" Marshall nodded. Blackwell pushed against the wall. The stone moved. Then another. The opening appeared, roughly 2 feet wide, just enough for a man to squeeze through, the moment between safety and the jump, between hope and catastrophe. Blackwell looked back once as if saying goodbye, then boosted himself through the opening and disappeared. 8 seconds passed like minutes. Thompson went next. Marshall counted. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. He took a breath, moved through the opening, and stepped into the void. The rope ladder was there. His hands found it. His feet found the knots. Below, he could see the chapel roof, impossibly far away, impossibly close. He descended fast, too fast. His hands burned against the rope. 13 meters down, 14. His feet hit the roof. Behind him, from inside the tower, he heard a shout. German. Urgent! The alarm, a bell clanging violently through the castle, a sound that meant escape in progress. Marshall didn't hesitate. He moved across the chapel roof toward the far edge. Behind him, he heard the second man arriving on the roof, Thompson already on his way down. Anderson was coming through. Fisher was counting seconds. Marshall jumped from the chapel roof and hit the ground below running. He made it 2 kilometers before the dogs caught him. 2 kilometers of woods and darkness, and the certain knowledge that Switzerland was only 5 kilometers away, 5 kilometers from freedom. But Thompson didn't stop, neither did Anderson. Thompson made it to Swiss territory and crossed the border successfully. Anderson was recaptured 2 kilometers from the border, so close he could see Swiss uniforms. Fisher got further. He made it all the way to the German-Swiss border, still in his German uniform, his papers good enough to almost fool the Swiss guards at the crossing. Almost. A single moment of doubt, a question asked with the wrong tone, and it was over. He was arrested. 3 out of 5 made it beyond the castle. 2 crossed international borders. 1 reached Switzerland. Not success by Colditz standards, but unprecedented. In 6 years of attempts, no one had come closer. Marshall was back in solitary confinement by evening, but this time something was different. This time he wasn't broken. This time he understood what was possible. There would be another attempt, and this time someone would make it all the way. Colditz Castle, October 1942, April 1945. Almost 3 years would pass. 3 years of more plans, more attempts, more failures. Marshall spent them in Colditz, watching other men try, watching some succeed, watching the fortress slowly transform from an impenetrable prison into an obsolete relic as the war ground toward its inevitable conclusion. The guards finally caught on that the castle's reputation was its own worst enemy. By late 1943, security was tightened. Escape attempts became not just dangerous, they became almost certain death. Most of the hardened escapers, the men who'd tried repeatedly, gradually accepted a new reality. Colditz was no longer about getting out. It was about surviving in. Marshall watched from a distance. He took no more risks. He worked the warehouse detail. He studied German. He helped other men plan their attempts, but he didn't participate. The lesson had been learned. 3 escapes, 3 failures. The 4th time was not the charm. Then, in early April 1945, everything changed. The artillery began in the pre-dawn darkness. Not distant this time. Close. American guns pounding the town of Colditz. Marshall heard the explosions and understood the war was ending. Not because he'd read it in a secret letter or heard it through the camp gossip network, but because history was finally catching up to Colditz Castle. By April 15th, the commandant had ordered an evacuation. The Prominente prisoners, those held as potential hostages, were moved toward Austria. Then the order came for the British officers to be transported as well. But the senior British officer, a lieutenant colonel named William Todd, refused. The prisoners knew what was about to happen. The Americans were coming. After 5 years, it was over. Todd's refusal was an act of defiance so simple, so perfect, that it needed no explanation. The commandant, faced with the prospect of having to shoot British officers on the steps of the castle while American shells rained down outside, backed down. He ordered the German guards to stand down. By noon, the castle was effectively under the control of its prisoners. Marshall stood in the courtyard when the first American soldier appeared at the gate. The man was young, maybe 22, with a carbine and an expression of careful confusion. He looked around the castle, at the medieval stones, the guard towers, the barbed wire, and seemed to be calculating whether this place was a fortress or a museum. "This is Oflag IVC," the soldier said, as if asking a question. "The prisoner camp." "Was," Marshall replied. "Now it's just a castle." The American looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Well, you're liberated, sir." "Sir? Not prisoner, not private. Sir." 43 pounds lighter than when he arrived. Hair turned gray at the temples, scars on his back from beatings he'd never mentioned in his reports, psychological scars that would take decades to acknowledge. But Marshall walked out of Colditz Castle a free man. The debriefing took 3 weeks at a processing center in France. Military intelligence wanted everything. Marshall drew diagrams of Stalag Luftwaffe and Colditz. He explained the tunnel methodology, The precise millimeter by millimeter loosening of stones, the makeshift tools, the perfect timing of digging during exercise periods. He described the rope ladder he'd used at Colditz, the angle of descent from the chapel roof, the exact moment he'd realized that Thompson had made it. They listened and took notes and filed reports in triplicate. When it was finally over, a senior officer with general's stars approached him in a hallway. "You did something remarkable," the general said. "Not just the attempts themselves, but what those attempts meant for other men. Do you understand?" Marshall understood. The tunnel at Stalag Luft III had shown others that it was possible. The Colditz escape had taught men that defiance was more important than success. Failure, when pursued relentlessly, became its own kind of victory. "There's a young British officer," the general continued, Harry Neve, made an escape from Colditz in January 42, dressed as a German guard, walked right out the front door. He wouldn't have tried it if he hadn't known your tunnel had almost worked. You understand me? Marshall nodded slowly. His 3 failures had created the template for another man's success. His stubborn refusal to accept that escape was impossible had given other men the courage to try. He was discharged in June 1945 with a Purple Heart and a commendation for his contributions to military morale and the furthering of escape education. He took a train to Pennsylvania, rented a small apartment above a pharmacy on Main Street, got a job as a warehouse manager, honest work, steady pay, no complications. The local newspaper ran a story. Local hero returns from German prison camps. They wanted him to give speeches at schools and town halls. He declined politely. He didn't want to be a hero. He wanted to be ordinary. He met a nurse named Catherine at the town square during a 4th of July celebration. She was sitting on a bench, eating ice cream. He sat down next to her without asking permission. "You look like someone who's been gone a very long time," she said. "5 years," Marshall replied. "German camps." She didn't ask about it. She just nodded and handed him a napkin from her purse because ice cream was dripping down his hand. They married in September 1945. They had 3 children. Marshall taught them to fix things, to solve problems, to never accept that something was impossible just because someone said it was. He coached Little League Baseball. He never mentioned the camps to his kids, but they knew, the way children know, that their father had been through something that had changed him in ways words couldn't capture. Years passed. Decades. Marshall watched the Berlin Wall go up in 61 and come down in 89. He watched the 50th anniversary of Colditz on television and recognized some of the men in the archival footage. Thompson had survived and become a teacher in England. Anderson had made it to Norway and died in 1988, fighting in the Norwegian resistance. Ward had stayed in Colditz until the very end and come home with medals and a secret he never spoke about. Harry Neve became a famous politician, an advisor to Margaret Thatcher. He wrote a book about his escape, including a detailed chapter about how the failed tunnels at Colditz had shown him what was possible. He never mentioned Marshall by name, but the story was there. A quiet American who tried and failed and tried again until other men learned to believe that escape was something you did, not something you hoped for. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of liberation, Marshall returned to Colditz for the first time since that April morning when the American soldiers opened the gates. The castle was a museum now. Tourists walked through the hallways where he'd spent months planning his escape. Children played in the exercise yard where he'd counted seconds, waiting for his turn to run. He stood in the chapel storage room, now a display case with a reconstructed rope ladder. The placard explained the escape attempts, the engineering, the 5 men who'd tried the chapel descent. It mentioned Marshall by name. American Private James Marshall, part of the October 1942 attempt. A young German woman, maybe 30 with kind eyes, noticed that the old American was crying. "Did you have someone here?" she asked gently. "Someone you wanted to escape." Marshall looked at her. He thought about whether to tell her, whether to explain that he'd spent 3 years within these walls, that he'd tried to escape 4 times, that he'd failed, been beaten, been locked in solitary confinement for months, that he'd watched men break and other men resist with a stubborn will that couldn't be explained. "I was here," he said finally, "a long time ago. I was a prisoner." The guide's expression softened. "Then you know what it took to survive this place." "I know what it took to refuse to accept that I couldn't leave," Marshall corrected. "That's not survival, that's defiance. And defiance is the only advantage any man ever really needs. Marshall lived another 15 years after his final visit to Colditz. He died peacefully in his sleep in 2010, Catherine holding his hand, surrounded by his children and grandchildren. His obituary in the local newspaper was modest. 2 paragraphs noting his military service and his warehouse career and his beloved family. It did not mention the rope ladder or the tunnel or the 4 escape attempts. But his grandchildren remembered his stories. They understood that their grandfather had been an ordinary man who'd done extraordinary things, not because he was special, but because he'd refused to believe that he wasn't. And sometimes that's the only advantage any man ever really needs. Pennsylvania, 1950. The nightmares came without warning, vivid, visceral, impossible to control. Marshall would wake at 2 or 3 in the morning, drenched in sweat, unable to remember if he was in a dark cell or in his own bedroom. Catherine would hold his hand until he came back to reality. She never asked what the dreams were about. She just waited. The pharmacy owner downstairs, Mr. Chen, noticed that Marshall sometimes forgot customer orders or stared at the warehouse inventory sheets without actually seeing them. But he was reliable. He showed up. He worked hard. That was enough. Marshall had never told his wife about the specifics of his imprisonment. Not the beatings, not the months in solitary where he'd counted scratches on concrete walls to maintain his sanity. Not the moment he understood that the human mind could break as easily as bones. But Catherine knew. She could see it in the way his hands sometimes trembled, in the way he couldn't stand being in small spaces, in the way he'd leave a room if it got too quiet. 1952, London. The reunion was held in a private club with leather chairs and photographs on the walls. Men from a dozen countries gathered: British, Polish, French, Dutch, Belgian, Norwegian. Some had made successful escapes. Some had been recaptured. All of them had the same tired eyes. Thompson was there, already balding, teaching geometry at a London school. Anderson was there, preparing to return to Norway. A British officer named Douglas Bader was there, a man who'd lost both his legs in combat, but had escaped Colditz 3 times. He moved through the room on prosthetics with the determined stride of someone who'd learned to overcome impossible obstacles. Marshall, Bader said, shaking his hand. Stalag Luft 3, then Colditz. I heard about your tunnel. Heard it didn't work, Marshall replied. Didn't work? Bader laughed. Your tunnel showed the Germans that Stalag Luft could be breached. After that, security improved everywhere. But more importantly, it showed us what was possible. You understand what I mean? Marshall understood. His failures had become a template for others' successes. Ward was supposed to be at the reunion, but he hadn't come. Marshall would later learn that Ward had been admitted to a hospital in 1948. The official diagnosis was listed as depression and psychological trauma, but the truth was simpler and more complex. Ward had never recovered from watching his plan collapse in real time at Colditz. From the moment the bell clanged, signaling that Marshall's escape had failed, something in him had broken that couldn't be repaired. Ward died in 1952, the year of the reunion. Though the circumstances were kept quiet, the official report mentioned complications from untreated illness. But everyone who knew him understood. The war had broken him in ways that time couldn't heal. The years that followed were outwardly normal. Marshall and Catherine had 3 children. He became an assistant manager at the warehouse. He coached his son's baseball team. He fixed things around the house and helped neighbors with their problems. He was the kind of man people trusted, reliable, quiet, competent. But the war never left him. In 1975, the BBC television series Colditz premiered. It was a drama loosely based on the real escape attempts, though it dramatized many of the details. Marshall watched an episode where actors depicted a chapel roof escape. The portrayal was mostly accurate, though they'd added Hollywood flair. The soldiers were younger, more athletic. The escape seemed more cinematic than it had felt in reality. Marshall recognized the moment when the fictional prisoner reached the chapel roof. The actor looked down at the ground below, a long fall, certain injury or death. And for a moment, in the television scene, the actor hesitated. That hesitation was the truest moment in the entire episode, because in the real escape, Marshall had hesitated too, for just a fraction of a second before he jumped. In that moment, he'd understood that he might die, that the rope ladder might not hold, that the fall, if it failed, would be fatal. He jumped anyway. 1995. the 50th anniversary of liberation. Marshall returned to Colditz at age 78, with Catherine at his side. She held his arm as they walked through the castle. The place was now a museum, neat, organized, preserved. The tour guides were young Germans who spoke about escape attempts with the professional detachment of historians trained to present facts without judgment. There was a display case featuring the reconstructed rope ladder Marshall had used. A museum official approached him, a woman in her 40s, kind-faced, professional. "We have documentation from your escape," she said. "Would you be willing to give us a recorded interview for the museum's archives?" Marshall agreed. They sat in a small office overlooking the courtyard where he'd spent so many days walking in circles, thinking about freedom. The interviewer asked him the standard questions. What was it like? Were you afraid? Did you think you'd make it? But then she asked something different. Do you regret it? The escapes, I mean. 4 attempts all failed. Did it accomplish anything? Marshall was quiet for a long time. He thought about Ward, who'd never recovered from the failure. He thought about the men who'd believed in those attempts, who'd spent months gathering supplies and digging tunnels and building rope ladders, only to watch it all come apart in moments. "I don't know if it accomplished anything in the practical sense," he finally said. "We didn't escape. We came back. The war ended anyway. The Germans lost regardless of whether I was in a prison camp or not." He paused, looking out of the window at the courtyard. "But there's a British officer named Harry Neve. He escaped from here in 1942, dressed as a German guard. He walked right out the front gate. If you ask him what made him try it, what made him believe it was possible, he'll tell you. He saw other men try. He saw men like me fail, but keep trying. And he understood that failure isn't the same as impossibility." The interviewer listened carefully, recording every word. "Neve became a politician," Marshall continued. "He advised prime ministers. He did important things. And part of that, a small part maybe, was that he believed he could do impossible things because he'd seen men refuse to accept that they were impossible." Catherine died in 2003. She was 82, and after 58 years of marriage, Marshall found he couldn't sleep in their bedroom anymore. He moved to the guest room. His children encouraged him to downsize, to move into assisted living. He refused. He'd spent enough time in places where he had no choice. His son found him in his study in 2010, sleeping in his reading chair. He'd simply stopped waking up, peacefully, quietly, at 93 years old. Epilogue. What remains? The obituary in the local newspaper was modest, as Marshall would have wanted it. It mentioned his military service, his career in warehouse management, his 3 children and 7 grandchildren. It noted that he was a quiet hero of World War II who served with distinction as a prisoner of war. None of the obituaries mentioned the tunnel. None of them mentioned the rope ladder or the chapel roof or the 4 failed escape attempts. None of them explained what it cost him to maintain the psychological strength to try, fail, and try again. But his grandchildren knew. They'd heard the stories, not because Marshall told them directly, but because their parents had overheard them in quiet moments. They understood that their grandfather had done something remarkable, not because he was special, but because he'd refused to accept that he wasn't capable of remarkable things. In 2012, a military historian researching POW escapes discovered Marshall's file in the National Archives. It was a simple folder: escape reports, disciplinary records, an interrogation summary. Nothing that suggested the psychological cost of his defiance. The historian found Marshall's daughter and interviewed her. She told stories her father had never written down, about the PTSD, about the nightmares, about the way he'd lived his entire post-war life, quietly managing a trauma that never fully healed. She talked about how he'd never wanted recognition, never wanted to be called a hero. He'd wanted simply to be ordinary. But he wasn't ordinary, the historian would later write in her book Courage in Confinement, The Untold Stories of Colditz. Because ordinary men accept their circumstances, James Marshall refused. And in that refusal, he changed not just his own life, but the lives of men who would follow. The book would go on to detail how Harry Neve, in his own memoirs, had written about the men who'd taught him what defiance meant. He mentioned Marshall by name, though they'd never actually met. "There was an American," Neve wrote, "who showed us that escape wasn't about succeeding. It was about refusing to accept that success was impossible. When he failed, he'd already won." Marshall never knew the full impact of his actions. He never understood that his 4 escape attempts had become legendary in military circles, that escape committees at other camps studied his methods, that countless POWs drew courage from the knowledge that a quiet American had tried the impossible and failed, but kept trying anyway. What he did know was this: Catherine loved him despite his nightmares. His children grew up respecting him. His grandchildren understood that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was fear, acknowledged fully, and then action anyway. And sometimes that knowledge, that quiet, personal understanding of one's own defiance, is the only victory that really matters.